here in Washington because President Trump yesterday doubled down on his call for nationalized elections after telling right-wing podcaster and former number 2 at the FBI, Dan Bongino, on Monday, Republicans should take over voting.
What exactly did you mean when you said that you should nationalize elections, and which 15 states are you talking about?
I want to see elections be honest, and if a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because, you know, if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. The federal government should get involved. These are agents of the federal government to count the votes. If they can't count the votes legally and honestly, then somebody else should take over.
The Constitution says it should be states that administer elections, Mr. President. That's what the Constitution
you know what?
says.
They can administer the election, but they have to do it honestly.
They are. They are doing it honestly. The president, though, still saying what he means, which is problematic because before those comments in the Oval, his White House press secretary was trying to walk back what the president said on Monday.
What the president was referring to is the SAVE Act, which is a huge common sense piece of legislation that Republicans have supported, that President Trump is committed to signing into law.
But to be clear, he does believe the state should oversee elections.
The president believes in the United States Constitution. However, he believes there has obviously been a lot of fraud and irregularities that have taken place in American elections. And again, voter ID is a highly popular and common sense policy that the president wants to pursue, and he wants to pass legislation to make that happen for all states across the country.
He didn't seem to be talking about that bill. He said plenty of opportunities to, especially because he met with Congresswoman Luna, who is one of the key people pushing it just a few days ago. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Republican leadership seemingly split on this issue. Got the Speaker, Mike Johnson, suggesting without evidence that there are instances of voter fraud in blue states. Watch.
What you're hearing from the president is his frustration about the lack of some of the blue states, frankly, of enforcing these things and making sure that they are free and fair elections. Well, in some of the states, like in California, for example, I mean, they hold the elections open for weeks after Election Day. That's just one thing that bothers so many people. We had 3 House Republican candidates who were ahead on Election Day in the last election cycle. And every time a new tranche of ballots came in, they just magically whittled away until their leads were lost. And no series of ballots that were counted after Election Day were our candidates ahead on any of those counts. It looks on its face to be fraudulent. Can I prove that? No, because it happened so far upstream. But we need more confidence in the American people in the election system, and it's essential. And everybody, no matter what party you're in, should agree with that.
Sometimes it takes a little while to count votes. And you know some of the last votes that come in? One's from troops overseas because they have to mail in their ballots. They are just some of the people who vote by mail. And by the way, Republicans previously were people who pushed for vote by mail, as well as thrived off of that practice. So, yes, sometimes when you count, leads change. It's exactly what has happened in 2020 and other elections before that. So, Speaker, that's the explanation there. But the Senate Majority Leader John Thune also took a more measured approach. He told reporters he's not in favor of federalizing elections, but that he supports stronger voter ID laws. He went on to say, quote, "I'm a big believer in decentralized and distributed power, and I think it's harder to hack 50 election systems than it is to hack one." MS Now senior Washington reporter, co-host of The Weekend, Eugene Daniels, joins us on a weekday. Yes. I always appreciate you. I mean, you and I were both sort of talking while we were listening to the speaker, while we were listening to the president. First of all, Trump always says what he means. Exactly. So if he was talking about the SAVE Act, he would talk about the SAVE Act. Yep. At the same time, when you watch the White House trying to put his comments back in a box and they fly right out, what does it tell you that I think even they know that they're getting into a sticky place on this?
The president has never not said what he believes. Correct. It's actually very good for his opponents, for us, for his opponents in the political realm, for reporters like us who cover him and the things that he says, that he says what he means, always. And what his team has always struggled to do, this was during the campaign in 2016, when he was president the first time around, and even to this day, is trying to not get ahead of him, but even after, trying to clean up after him. Because you just go directly to him again. He's like, no, I don't care what Caroline Leavitt said. This is what I mean, right? To be very clear, the Constitution lays out how states or in elections in this country happen, period. Part of the reason they're decentralized is actually harder to hack back into and change laws based on, as what Thune said, change the kinds of elections that we're having in this country. It's really important that people understand that. It's also important to understand that this is something Trump has been kind of like red ballooning for a while, trial ballooning for a while, right? That someone should take it over. He called the states agents of the federal government. That is not what Republicans have for, as long as we've been alive, been talking about, right? That they're supposed to be very separate, actually, that federalism matters.
Decentralized is the word that Thune used, sounding like a conservative.
Exactly. And so it's also interesting to watch the Republican Party completely, and I know we've been talking about this for years, but change its stripes on yet another issue when it comes to states' rights versus federal rights.
Yep. I mean, look at the way also that John Thune, again, is sounding like a Republican, saying he wants a decentralized state system that is separate from the federal government. I mean, that was always a conservative plank.
Yeah.
And then you've got Mike Johnson, frankly, echoing what Trump himself was saying after the 2020 election. He was like, wait, all of a sudden, the leads that I had in a state like Pennsylvania, they keep counting votes and now I'm losing. That is just literally how it works.
Yeah.
But when you watch the Speaker of the House giving credit to these kinds of conspiracy theories, what does that say about where we're going?
No, we're good. Because at the end of the day, even when he was talking and he said, can I prove it? No. Then you shouldn't be saying it, sir.
Correct.
And he knows that, right? Mike Johnson is one of those folks. We know him. He knows better, right? He does actually know better than a lot of these things. He's also a constitutional lawyer.
I was going to say, he was also the architect of one of the plans of how they could overturn a false slates of elector in 2020.
Exactly. And so, like, we've seen him turn over and be very different. And that happens when people get a little bit of power in this country. They start to echo what Donald Trump is saying. There are ways, and Johnson has been good at this in different ways, but trying to, like, weasel away from what Trump is saying without pissing him off and being on the other side of him. That is not what he's doing here. He's echoing it. It's not true. Voting happens, and then we count. Now, if they talked about we want more resources in these states, we want to help you count faster. You know what I mean? We want to figure out how to fund voter ID around the country. These are things you could actually do to make, if you want the voting to be done on that Tuesday, those are the kinds of things you could do.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important that after the 2020 election, there were a lot of lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and its allies, as well as states actually going in and doing autopsies of if there was any moments of fraud that could have meaningfully changed the outcome of the election. And none of those came back and said, yeah, actually there were. This is just a falsehood that the White House is now reviving. They're doing it by going and getting ballots in Georgia and Fulton County. And then, of course, the fact that the speaker is echoing it. This is just what happens when you count the votes that Americans cast lawfully as Americans. I mean, this is fundamental to us.
Yeah.
We are, of course, going to keep a lot of eyes on that story.